With that, we can kick it off with our first speaker. Please welcome Chuck Nicholson. He's a clinical professor of supply chain management at Penn State University and an associate adjunct professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Formerly a Dairy Innovation Hub funded faculty member at UW-Madison, he is a recognized expert in dairy markets, milk pricing, and supply chain economics. Please welcome Chuck.
Oh, okay, I'm good. Okay, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm not sure I'm really an expert on anything, but thanks for humoring me on that. Great to be back. Great to have conversations with so many familiar faces. We really should say, as the program says, I'm UW plus. In this case, even though I get paid by Penn State, maintain ongoing relationships and collaborations. Okay, so what I want to do is talk about an example of hub work that has some really nice characteristics. First, it involves different disciplines. We have food science. Where's Grace? Yeah, thanks, Grace, from UW River Falls. Business and economics. Has a long list of organizations affiliated with it. I had to put Penn State first, but maybe I'll put animal and dairy sciences as first in my heart or something like that. Collaboration also here with Scott Rankin in the Department of Food Science, and then we have collaboration with a PhD student at Cornell University in the Dyson School. We also have 2 PhD students involved in this work, so happy to be able to talk about it. So maybe a little hard for you to see, but this is a map of the global prevalence of lactose intolerance. Don't worry so much about the numbers, but the darker colors means a higher proportion of people have some kind of issue with lactose. This is kind of a motivating factor for what we're talking about, in part because if we think about the U.S. role in export markets going forward, this is something that we might need to take a little bit more consideration of when we think about designing and developing and shipping products. So here in the U.S., even 30 to 50 million people are lactose intolerant. I'm not going to have you raise your hand to say whether or not you are lactose intolerant or not. But we have food processing technologies available to us in many cases to reduce the lactose amounts that are in products that are not naturally reduced, like maybe more things like aged cheeses. And the other part of this is we don't really have a whole lot of information about how consumers perceive or value these kinds of products. And if you're going to try and make a business model that's successful for selling these products, it's actually one of the things that's kind of helpful to know. So what we set out to do was understand what do we know about previous lactose-related valuation research. And if you Google lactose-free product, you will see a bunch of stuff that looks like this. There's going to be an amazing market for lactose-free products in the future. And they don't really tell you very much about the specifics. If you pay $5,000, then you can get their idea of what those specifics look like. But they don't actually tell you a lot about how they came up with the valuations of these market projections or what it would mean to an individual consumer. So what we're trying to do is think a little bit about more focused study. There's a relatively limited amount of knowledge on previous valuation studies. One was done with Turkish consumers. Many of them were aware of the product but didn't purchase it, partly because of pricing issues. There's actually evidence that many consumers would pay less for products that have less lactose. I think the idea is it's not really the full product. It's not natural somehow. Something's been done to it. Okay. And when we come to frozen desserts, both of those are for fluid milk products. When we come to frozen desserts, there's only a limited amount of information that suggests that consumers view taking the lactose out as a negative. Okay? So this is some of the background of what we were trying to do, but there's relatively few studies that look at lactose and ice cream valuation. One of the things that we found really interesting is that when you ask somebody, how do you feel about lactose-free products, and don't ask them if they're lactose intolerant, it's kind of a shortcoming of the information they have available to you. So relatively few studies did that, and many of the methods that were used were maybe not really the ones that we think of as being the best. So we set out to try and address each of those kinds of limitations of the previous work. Right? So I'm not going to ask Grace to talk about all of this, but this is part of the way in which you make ice cream. I'm just going to say basically that typically at an aging and storing step, you can actually have lactase enzyme put in there and reduce the amount of lactose in the ice cream. We have technologies that allow us to do that. But we set out here was to assess how much would consumers pay for lactose-reduced ice cream or lactose-free ice cream. We actually did this across 3 different product categories: regular ice cream that had all lactose, a lactose-reduced product, and a lactose-free product. Wanted to estimate the impact of providing additional information. So one of the things we think about is lactose content is one of the things that people would pay attention to, but when you make this product, you can actually also use less added sugar because the sugars that are broken down by the lactase enzyme are sweeter. Okay? And we also wanted to evaluate whether providing additional information about actually using that ingredient, the enzyme, made people say, oh, this isn't natural, I don't want to use it anymore. Right? So we had this thing we call an information treatment. And importantly, we want to understand what's the role of self-reported lactose intolerance status. And so we asked them about their degree of tolerance, and then we also asked them if they had had any testing done to sort of see, did you really take this seriously, and you had a medical professional evaluate you. Okay. Right. So the methods that we used for the data collection to get this valuation, we used something called a Becker-de-Hoodt-Marshak experimental auction. How many of you have heard of that? Okay, the ag economists in the room are raising their hands. If you can say that 3 times fast, actually you're even better than the ag economists who know about what this is. It's something that we call incentive compatible. You're trying to get people, what we find is if you just say how much would you value something, people tend to overvalue or undervalue. So this is a way of setting it up so it's hard for them to game the system and give you a value that isn't like their true value. Okay? The way this works is we said, hey, come to our auction session, we'll give you $25. It's going to take about 30 minutes. Okay? You're going to be tasked with providing bids on 3 different products, the regular, the lactose-reduced, and lactose-free, in 2 different rounds. I'll show you more about how that works in a minute. We give an information treatment, that extra information about the ingredients and the amount of sugar that's in the product. And unlike a usual auction where the highest bid wins, this is sort of a randomly selected price. And if you as a person bid more than that amount, you are the lucky winner of actual ice cream. Okay, so one of the things is, this is not the actual ice cream that Grace and her students from River Falls made, but there was actual lactose-free ice cream that we brought over from the Babcock Dairy store as part of this. And we actually auctioned this off. So if somebody bid more than the amount that we said was sort of like this minimum price that we selected randomly, they won the auction, they got a half gallon of lactose-free ice cream, and they got the difference between the $25 and the amount that we had selected as the price. Okay, so this is, maybe it's a little bit complicated, you don't need to know the details, but the idea is to make it incentive compatible. Don't cheat on what you really think the valuation is. Okay. So the auction process, we did a hypothetical practice round. First round of auction, people placed bids on each of the values that they would place on the 3 different ice cream products, gave them some additional information, allowed them to look at that and process that information, had them submit a second round of bids, and then we gave them an exit questionnaire that asked demographic information and the self-reported lactose tolerance information. Okay? This is a little bit hard for you to see. You'll have slides, I guess, available later on, but this is sort of the detailed information that we provided about serving sizes, sugar, lactose, and the ingredients listing. Okay? So this is how we kind of set this up. But one of the things that we did in the self-evaluated degree of lactose tolerance was we asked people which category best fits you. High tolerance, I never have any problems. Moderate tolerance, occasional symptoms. Limited, frequent, and very limited every time I consume lactose in any form, I have a problem with it. Okay, so this is a bit self-reported. We also looked at their ability to say that they had been tested, have glucose tolerance tests and other things like that that were part of this. And so we use this information primarily to help us understand, does this affect how much people value the products that we're looking at? All right. So we use some statistical models of different kinds. We have a situation that many of you are familiar with as panel data. We have multiple observations for a single observational unit. So we had 6 bids from each of the participants in this. So we use these random effects and censored random effects models. We had 4 different types of variables. We looked at the product type. Is it the regular type? Is it the lactose-reduced type? Is it the lactose-free type? We had the product times the information treatment. Okay, so when you showed the information and you were talking about the regular ice cream, did it affect the bid value that you had? Okay. We had demographics and shopping behavior. We actually asked people how frequently they consumed ice cream. You'll be happy to know that 96% of the people said they consumed ice cream at least once a month. Okay. This is actually one of the comments we got back from a reviewer was, didn't you make sure you had ice cream consumers? And we said, this was Wisconsin, we didn't need to. Okay. Actually, this whole thing, when we announced for the participation in this study, we sent out one of these email listings to like all the faculty and staff, and apparently this thing went viral, like some crazy guy's doing a study about whether Wisconsin people like ice cream. And it was like all over the internet and the stuff within the university. I was like, okay, that's kind of disrespectful. But anyways. And then finally, this important thing of the degree of lactose tolerance times the product. So does it matter for your bid on a lactose-free product how lactose intolerant you are? All right. So a little bit hard for you to see the math there, but just to show that we actually did some of the math, there's the random effects model. And a censored random effects model is just taking into account the fact that we have some bids that could be down at the bottom end and up at the high end where somebody might have wanted to bid higher than the $10 value that we allowed, but they were not able to do that. Okay, so we can account for that and test the stats on that. Okay, so what do we find? We had 135 participants. If you multiply that times 6, that's the number of observations that we have in total to work with. We had primarily people under 35 years of age and female, many with advanced degrees and higher than average incomes. This is maybe a little bit of an issue of doing this in a university town like this. Primarily white and Asian ethnicity were the people who came to the sessions. Again, 96% consumed ice cream monthly. We did have a higher prevalence of lactose intolerance than the general population. And part of the reason for that is we recruited people and said, you can come whoever you are, but we're particularly interested in the opinions of people who have some degree of lactose intolerance, right? So here we had 40% said, I never have any problems, but 60% of the respondents had some issue with lactose at some level of consumption. And the biggest category was really, I occasionally have problems. So we did have some people who said very limited tolerance and limited tolerance. Okay. So we have 60% of the people who say lactose can be an issue for me. And when we look at the overall average bids, what's a good price? What's an average price for a half-gallon ice cream here in Madison? Okay, those are good, but they are lower than these, and they're actually lower than the national average, which is about $5.43. Okay, but depends on the brand you're buying. We were sort of saying this was a premium brand ice cream. You maybe pay a little bit. It was on sale. Okay, okay. So, okay. Well, we did have any number of people who said, I eat ice cream every day. I was like, oh, yeah, let's talk. So this is actually looking at the regular, okay, in round 1 and round 2, the first bars there, the reduced and the lactose-free. Again, the first reported one is what they said before we gave them additional information. The second is what they said afterwards. This is highlighting the fact that when we just looked at the averages, people said, I value lactose-free ice cream the highest. And this is across all of the people who were part of the study, okay? Turns out that actually when we gave people more information about the ice cream, the regular bid, but not the other ones, went down. They're like, oh, there's that much sugar in there? Oh, there's that much fat? I don't know exactly what the response was, but I think there was a little bit of that going on for the regular ice cream. Okay? So these are going to be hard to see a little bit with the slide you have on the actual results, but let me kind of break this out. We have these 2 different types of models. So there's this random effects and this censored random effects. And then we start out by saying, let's just look at the product and the interactions. And then we say, let's add some controls, and that be things like, how old are you? What's your income? What's your level of education? And then the most complete of these would say, what's the product and the interaction with the information? What's your characteristics as a consumer? And what's your lactose intolerance status? Okay, and I think basically I'm going to highlight the places where we have these more complete models because these are probably the places where we're doing the best job of taking into account the different factors that would affect the valuation. Okay, so I mentioned the mean bid was $5.43, which is actually a little bit lower than the national average price for a half gallon of ice cream. Okay, and when we don't control for lactose intolerance, we actually see a positive effect of the product being lactose-free. okay, but not lactose-reduced. So overall, if we're not accounting for the lactose intolerant status of people, they say, yeah, reducing lactose is a good thing, okay? But what happens when we control for that is actually what we find is people who don't have an issue with lactose value the lactose in the product, and they would put a negative value on having the lactose taken out of the ice cream, okay? So it decreases the value, and you're looking at close to a 10% reduction in the value for consumers who don't have an issue with lactose if you take the lactose out. Okay. Then, and the information treatment actually didn't affect the values in this case. All right. So if we then start to look at the interaction with the lactose tolerant status, everything ended up being statistically significant regardless of the type of product, lactose-reduced or lactose-free, and regardless of whether somebody had moderate tolerance, limited tolerance, or very limited tolerance, okay? The values differed a little bit, but all of these things were statistically significant, and as you notice, they flipped around the nature of the response for people who were not lactose intolerant. So it's for all tolerance levels in lactose-free products, and the consumers without, or with high tolerance value products, the consumers with high intolerance highly valued products with less lactose. I can't even say that again myself and keep it straight. Basically, if you have high intolerance, you like the product a lot more if it doesn't have the lactose in it, okay? So consumers with high tolerance would pay less for the ice cream without lactose, and that's the thing that I mentioned previously. So what we're doing here by controlling for the lactose tolerance status is really understanding the differences between consumers who don't have an issue with lactose, they can tolerate it well, and consumers who do have an issue with it, for whom the valuation structure is a lot different. Okay, so let's think a little bit about this in terms of the end game and willingness to pay. So I've got the two products here. I've got a high tolerance, moderate tolerance, limited tolerance, very limited tolerance that I'm going to show you. And if we look at how much would you pay if you're highly lactose tolerant for lactose-reduced or lactose-free ice cream, I would say you would have to pay me 50 cents a half gallon to take it. Okay? If I have moderate tolerance, there's a little bit of a difference between the lactose-reduced and lactose-free. The lactose-free ice cream is more highly valued, but now I'd pay you 50 cents for that product. If I have limited tolerance, a little bit of a bump up on the lactose-reduced, but a bigger jump on the lactose-free side. And if I have very limited tolerance, again, a bit of a jump on the lactose-reduced, but a much larger jump in terms of what I'm willing to pay, up to $2 a half gallon for the lactose-free product if I have that characteristic of very high lactose intolerance, okay? So this is a part of the story here, but the other part of it is we need to say, okay, but how much does it cost me to actually make this ice cream, right? So this is a very rough initial estimate. The cost changes that we can look at primarily rely on what does it cost to use the enzyme itself to break down the lactose. I can use less sugar, so I save a little bit of money there. It takes me more time, so I have more labor. The basic bottom line is the additional costs look like that, but the willingness to pay is greater than that first estimated cost for all of them except for the moderately tolerant consumers, okay? So basically, the other thing that's interesting about this is it looks like consumers are willing to pay more than it would cost me to make the product. But if you look at national brands, or if you go to the Babcock Dairy store and look at their lactose-free product, do they charge more for the lactose-free product over there? And the same is true of most of the national brands. So they price it at the same level as their other product categories. So even though consumers value it more, the pricing strategy becomes a little bit important because if you have these additional costs and you're going to charge the same price for it, it becomes a little bit of an issue that you're not actually going to gain that additional benefit from what consumers are willing to pay. So in our paper, we actually talk about the fact that there are some other benefits to having a broader product mix, attracting more business into the store that buys other parts of your products, but that's an indirect benefit rather than a direct, I make money, I make a margin on the product that we're actually selling here. Okay. So bottom line, hey, surprise, people who are lactose intolerant are willing to pay more for lactose-free products. We quantified that, and it's something that was surprising that hadn't really previously been done. This may actually explain some of the previous negative responses that we gotten because it didn't separate out the people who did value it from the people who don't value it or wouldn't pay less for it. And then again, part of understanding the approach to this possible product line is understanding how that willingness to pay interacts with costs and pricing strategies. Okay. So we actually already have some next steps in mind where we're trying to do a broader review of lactose and its valuation and lactose-reduced products. And we also want to do some better cost modeling of this to understand how this would really work in a mid-size ice cream processing facility. Okay. So thanks to Grace Lewis and the students who made the ice cream. Jack, where are you? Thanks for helping out with the auction. And we had funding from these good folks. Okay, so thanks.
So we have time for a couple questions.
I buy it once a week. But is there complementary research that tells me what lactose is, the consumer perception? I always thought it, because it didn't have something, that it tasted different, and I never tried it.
Yeah, so I think maybe what you're talking about is if you would buy a lactose or lactate product, a milk, it tends to taste sweeter. And that's because you break down the two sugars and you get the two component sugars of lactose, and collectively they are, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure, they are sweeter than the lactose sugar is itself. And so it does tend to have a little bit different taste. Sometimes the processing that's done to it makes it have a little bit different taste as well. We didn't notice any issues with the change in the taste of the ice cream. We made it, but I think it's a little bit different process. I don't know, Grace, do you have something to add to that, or?
No,
Okay.
and their name, lactate, sounds kind of medical.
Yeah, no, well, actually, you'd be glad to know Breyers has a perfectly good lactose-free brand. That's a national brand, but
I was just wondering if it influences the price perception.
yeah.
But they haven't.
Here we didn't tell them that it would. Well, I guess we showed them it was Babcock ice cream, but we said it was like premium ice cream made here in Wisconsin. We didn't brand it otherwise.
Yeah, so it's actually a very physical process. So the same enzyme that breaks down lactose within your gastrointestinal tract, if you can digest lactose, it's called lactase. All we do is we add it into the ice cream mix. So it breaks down lactose into glucose and galactose. And those two, glucose and galactose, are a little bit sweeter than lactose was initially. So it's actually we talk about ultra-processed foods, right? That's not this. It's minimally processed in this case. A minimal additional step relative to regular ice cream.
Okay, thanks. Oh.
Thanks, Chuck. Very, very interesting. My understanding is the lactose intolerance increases with age. So being your population under 35, I believe, in your data, so how would you extrapolate that to older population? And they will have more wealth, more buying capacity as well, right?
Yeah. Oh, Victor, thank you for that question. I should have boned up more on my human physiology related to lactose intolerance, but my understanding from having looked at this a little bit more in the context of kind of international dairy development is that much of that intolerance takes place at a fairly young age. The development of that intolerance takes place at a fairly young age, like after weaning in the first few years. So I don't know. I'd actually have to go look at, like, between 35 and 60, how big an issue is it that it declines further. But I think the majority of the decline happens before you get to, like, your adult years. In which case, we're mostly talking about a level of, and to a certain extent, we didn't actually try and control for age versus lactose intolerance status here. But presumably, we could actually go back and look at that and see if there's any connection between those two things. Yeah.
So I know we have more questions, but just for time, I'm going to keep us going so that all the presenters have even time. Thank you, Chuck, again.
Thanks a lot.